Italy is in trouble. The country is seen as one of the most beautiful places on earth, and millions seemingly dream of living there. Yet every year, tens of thousands of young, skilled Italians leave in search of a better life. This is a problem which is only getting worse. Over the last decade, more than 1 million young graduates have left the country, and this brain drain is estimated to cost 130 billion euros, and the outflow hasn't slowed. In 2024 alone, nearly 100,000 graduates left the country. The Italian government has tried a number of things to fix this, but none seem to be working, whilst at the same time, a very different kind of policy has also been rolled out. In 2017, Italy introduced a special tax plan for wealthy newcomers. Instead of paying normal rates, they can opt for a fixed annual fee, which means in practice, some millionaires pay less tax than locals earning a middle-class salary.
Italy says it wants young people to stay, but then offers millionaires a tax deal that lets them pay less than middle-class workers. That's not illegal, it's policy, but it sends a loud message about who the system is built for.
Government's actions tell a different story. The clearest incentives in the system are aimed at people who never grew up there at all. So how did one of Europe's most admired countries become a place where its own young people can't afford to stay, while rich outsiders get tax discounts to move in? For a lot of young Italians, this isn't a dramatic decision anymore. It's just the only move that makes sense. Whole age groups are thinning out, and in more and more places, the people drawing pensions outnumber the people paying in. As bad as all of this sounds, it isn't the first time Italy has watched people pack up their bags and leave for another country. Italy has always had people on the move. In the early 1900s, millions of Italians left for the US and South America to escape rural poverty. Back home, they were trapped on small plots, working long hours for wages that barely covered food. And for many, leaving wasn't a dream.
Mass emigration wasn't some romantic adventure. It was economic survival. When leaving your country becomes the only way out, that's a failure of opportunity, not ambition. Scales hash, and here's the key parallel. When governments can't provide upward mobility, migration becomes a rational legal choice, not a betrayal.
Dozens of others were hiring anyone who could show up and work. For a lot of families, this was the first time a stable wage was even possible. You could find work in the north, buy a small flat, maybe even own a car. So people stopped dreaming about America and started moving to Milan and Turin instead. The economy was booming, cities were growing, and by the 1980s, Italy's living standards had caught up with much of Western Europe. In large part, what had caused this boom was increasing productivity. That is, upgrades in machines and technology, which meant people could produce more with the same amount of effort. But around the 1990s, there started to be a shift, and this is really where Italy's problems begin to unfold. This was an era of globalization and technological advancement. Many other nations were busy rewiring their economies around computers, larger firms, and global supply chains. But Italy had hit a structural wall. Its economy was still built on small, family-run firms designed for an earlier era, a model that had worked when incremental upgrades were enough to stay competitive. But by the 1990s, that model had hit its limit. Competing now required scale, professional management, and real investment in new technology. Italian firms were simply too small and too tightly controlled to make that leap. And that's the ironic part. The family-centered business culture people admire in Italy today was the same force that made modernization difficult. These firms were loyal and stable, but they resisted mergers, avoided outside capital, and kept doing things the old way, even as the new world moved on.
This is the quiet killer of Italy's economy. Small, family-run firms sound charming, and they are, but modern global markets reward scale, speed, and capital. When businesses refuse outside investment or professional management, productivity stalls. Chart with downward trend, and when productivity stalls, wages freeze. That's not opinion, that's economics.
Market split into two groups: insiders and outsiders. Insiders were older workers with permanent contracts that were expensive and complicated to terminate, whereas outsiders were mostly younger people pushed into fixed-term contracts that had no real security. You could finish university, send out dozens of applications, and still end up with a 6-month contract paying just enough to live at home with your parents. When the contract ended, you went back to the start of the queue. On paper, you were employed, but you were never able to build the kind of life your parents had built off a single stable job. The wider systems didn't help either. Starting a business meant dealing with layers of bureaucracy that moved slowly. and Italy regularly ranks as one of the hardest places in Europe to enforce contracts and get projects approved, with civil cases often taking
Civil cases take 2 years or more. Contracts lose power. Investors hesitate. Businesses stay small to avoid risk. Scales hashing court terms. Justice delayed isn't just justice denied, it's growth denied. White right pointing backhand index. Would you invest your future in a system that moves this slowly?
poorer on paper, but the future was opening up. Now Italy is richer on paper, but for many young people, the future feels like it's closing. Usually when a country grows steadily over decades, living standards rise, new industries appear, and the next generation feels confident about building its life at home. In Italy, that promise has broken down. For more than 20 years, the economy has barely moved. Productivity flatlined, wages stalled, and the kind of opportunities young people expected never really materialized. If you're in your 20s now, you're stepping into a world that feels stuck compared to the ones your parents described. Nowhere is this more present than in the labour market. Millions of Italians now work without a stable contract, and most of them are under 30. Technically employed, but with no real savings, no security, and no clear path forward. Wages also turn that into a trap. Italy still has no national minimum wage, and close to 40% of private sector workers earn under €10 an hour. That means, for a young full-time employee, their monthly paycheck is around €1,300 to €1,400. Once you pay for transport and food, there is very little left over. Meanwhile, similar entry-level jobs in Germany or the Netherlands often pay hundreds of euros more per month, even before promotions. Housing also turns that mess into something that feels worse. Rents in Milan, Rome, and Florence have jumped far ahead of wages. In Milan, for instance, a one-bedroom flat now costs several €100 more than a typical young worker can reasonably cover. For anyone on a standard contract, even a modest place can swallow half of their income. Outside the big cities, the market is also frozen, but in a different way. Because wages have barely moved, while housing costs have climbed for decades, families hold on to property because it's one of the few stable assets in a stagnant economy, so homes tend to stay with families for generations. This adds another layer of difficulty getting onto the property ladder. And Italy is among the countries with the highest average age of leaving home in Europe, with many young adults staying with their parents well into their 30s, while in Northern Europe, people often tend to move out between 18 and 20. Many people joke that the only realistic way to own a home in Italy is to wait for an inheritance, because buying one outright would save.
This might be the most quietly brutal statistic in the entire video. If the only realistic path to home ownership is inheritance, then success stops being about work and starts being about birthright. House, that's how inequality hardens into generations, even without breaking a single law.
While everyone else stays put, and over time the South loses more and more of its young working population, while the North concentrates the highest salaries and most competitive jobs. This is compounding an already significant divide. When we were doing the research for this video, we ended up watching a lot of these kind of speeches. But there was a problem. A lot of these are all in Italian. You can rely on subtitles, but you still miss tone, slang, and the real meaning behind what people are saying. I wanted to actually understand more, so I started to use today's sponsor, LingoPie. I'm learning through real TV shows and films instead of boring lessons. I can click any word in the subtitles for an instant translation, and it automatically saves as a flashcard so I can remember it for later. That alone has helped my vocabulary stick far better than anything else I've tried before. And the AI pronunciation tool has also been surprisingly useful, because I can practice lines from the show and get proper feedback on how close I am to a native speaker. And the scale of the library makes a real difference. There are over 3,000 shows across 14 languages, so it genuinely feels like immersion rather than studying. It also doesn't really feel like boring learning, so even just watching 10 minutes a day of a show has improved my listening massively. If you want to try it, use my link in the description for a 7-day free trial and 55% off the annual plan. Now let's get back to the video. Italy is almost two countries in one. The northern regions like Lombardy, Veneto, and Emilia-Romagna hold most of the advanced manufacturing, finance, and export-oriented industries, whereas in the south, regions have far fewer dynamic employers and far higher unemployment, as they account for nearly a third of Italy's population, but only about 22% of its economic output. In some of these regions, only around 45% of people aged 15 to 64 have a job, compared with more than 70% across the European Union as a whole. This divide also shows up in income. Northern provinces produce levels of output per person that look more like Austria or southern Germany, while parts of the south sit closer to 2/3 of the EU average. For a young person, that gap isn't abstract. It shapes everything from your starting salary to whether you can even imagine building a life where you grew up. And once enough young people leave, that decline compounds. There are fewer locals to start companies, fewer taxpayers to support public services, and fewer families putting children into schools. Classrooms merge, some close altogether, and small shops start to disappear as spending power drains away. Meanwhile, the North keeps pulling ahead because that's where both the talent and the investment flow. For many young Southerners, staying in their region means giving up on the kind of careers they know exist elsewhere. And this is where one of Italy's real problems start to emerge. When jobs feel temporary, pay is weak, and housing is expensive, people start delaying families. Italy now records fewer births each year than any time since it became a unified state. Recent figures show annual births at around 370,000, while deaths exceeded births by hundreds of thousands. At the same time, people are living longer, so each year there are fewer young workers and more retirees drawing pensions. That is how you end up with a country where there are far more people over 65 than under 35. The politics of why Italy is the way it is start to click once you see the age structure being developed. Italy spends more on pensions than almost any other country in Europe. Year after year, roughly 15% of everything the country produces goes into pensions, compared with closer to 11 or 12% in many other EU economies. That is money other countries put into schools, childcare, or helping people into work. Close to 40% of Italy's entire social budget goes to retirement benefits, while the level of money going into support for families and children sits near the bottom of Western European rankings. That pattern is not an accident. For decades, Italian politics has been built around protecting retirees. Special schemes for certain professions, like public sector workers, railway staff, and some state-owned companies, alongside so-called baby pensions that once let people retire in their early 50s, were all part of a political bargain that traded generous replacement rates and early retirement deals for votes and social peace. Older Italians also turn out to vote more than anyone else, and they make up a big share of the electorate. They are organised, they follow politics closely, and parties know they cannot afford to lose them. Now, this is a trend that you see pop up across quite a lot of countries with ageing populations, whether it be in France, Spain, the United Kingdom. So any serious attempt to rebalance the system, whether it's tightening pension rules, lifting retirement ages again, or shifting money towards childcare and support for young families, carries real risk. In practice, it means telling the most reliable voters in the country that their benefits might shrink, so that people who often earn less and vote less can get a little more. Protests, strikes, and electoral punishment all lurk in the background, so governments tend to avoid these fights. They protect what is already in place. Pension promises are honoured, benefits for current retirees are guarded, and reforms that would help young people are often watered down, delayed, or quietly dropped. The result is a system built to preserve the position of those who made it through the old model, not to make life easier for those entering it now. And when Italy does decide to be bold on tax policy, it often doesn't start with young people. In 2017, the government introduced a special flat tax regime for high net worth individuals who moved their tax residence to Italy. Rather than paying standard rates on their foreign income, they can choose to pay a fixed lump sum each year, no matter how much they earn abroad. That lump sum started around €100,000, but was later doubled and is now set to rise again. So far, only a few thousand people have actually used the scheme, but they're among the richest in the world, with many settling in Milan and other desirable cities, buying property and plugging into a simplified tax life. From the government's perspective, this looks efficient. A few thousand wealthy residents paying a flat €200,000 or €300,000 a year adds up to a few €100 million in extra revenue, without the political pain of touching pensions or rewriting labour law. But when you set that against the rest of the budget, the limits become clear. Even if every eligible millionaire signed up, the flat tax scheme would only cover a sliver of that bill. In 2023, roughly 1,500 people used the regime, bringing in a few €100 million of revenue, which is nothing when you realise Italy spends well over €300 billion a year on social protection and pensions. The money also lands unevenly, and most of these newcomers concentrate in a few rich cities and neighbourhoods, buying expensive homes and using high-end services. That helps local real estate markets and a narrow slice of the economy, but it doesn't turn into the broad-based wage growth for the young people stuck.
Here's the final irony. The flat tax sounds bold, modern, and business-friendly. but in budget terms, it's a drop in the ocean. It doesn't fix youth unemployment, housing,